So hello everyone, and a very warm welcome back to the final panel of this year's CIS and Central Eastern European Spectrum Management Conference. So we're continuing our look at some of the key frequency bands now. We've looked at the UHF band, we've looked at the mid band, and we're now going to have a look at the millimeter wave band and look at balancing the connectivity requirements of 5G with other key users in the millimeter wave frequency. So we're going to be having a panel on that starting in just a minute or so. Just a reminder that following that, we're then going to have our conclusion session for the conference. We're going to be hearing from some of our industry participants on what their key takeaways for the conference are. And then after that, we're going to be having a final summary, which is going to be led by Albert Nalbandian, where we're going to be looking to draw some final conclusions from the event overall. But for now, focus, as I said, is on millimeter wave frequencies. So I'd like to welcome to the stage our moderator for this session, Farid Nakli from ITU. Farid, hi, welcome back. Good to see you again. And yeah, really looking forward to this session. I think it's the first time we've actually covered millimeter wave frequencies at this CIS event, and I had a session specifically on that. So really looking forward to it. So without further ado, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan, and happy to be here and to moderate this session. Always interesting to discuss the concrete band and to see what are the interests of different stakeholders and what is the best way forward, which is definitely always a consensus-based way forward. So, okay, let me switch to Russian and introduce our speakers. Позвольте, продолжить представление участников на русском языке. И у нас первый участник — это Валерий Тихвинский, заместитель генерального директора по инновациям, технологиям ООО «Национальный научно-исследовательский институт технологий связи». Стив Грин, руководитель группы по техническому регулированию спектра Ofcom. Луиджи Ардито, старший директор по связям с государственными органами Qualcomm. И Эми Мехлем, вице-президент по делам правительства США и политики компании Viasat. Да, вот я в чате вижу, что у Валерия проблемы пока с подключением. Он был на связи, но... Yeah, so switching back to English again. So we see that Valerie is having connectivity issues at the moment, and let me invite our second speaker and to speak first, Mr. Steve Green, Head of Technical Regulation Spectrum Group at Ofcom. Steve, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, Farid, thank you for that welcome, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm Steve Green. I work for the Spectrum Group in Ofcom as Head of Technical Regulations, and I'm also Chair of ECC PT1 and CPT. So this has got a bit of a flavour of how we've been looking at the issues in 26 and 40 gigahertz, which are the key first millimeter wave bands we've been looking at. So if we turn to the next slide, please. So as the background, the WRC at the end of 2019 identified a number of global bands for international mobile telecommunications, some also known as 5G. Key ones there are the 26 to 40 and 66 to 71 gigahertz. There are other bands identified in various parts of and regions of the world and in certain countries, but these are the ones that we focused on from the European perspective for 5G. And in particular on that 40 gigahertz band, it's the upper part that we're looking at for mobile deployments. Next slide, please. So thinking about how we balance the needs of all the users in that spectrum, this is a quick overview of the primary allocations in that 26 gigahertz band. And you can see there's quite a lot of different usages there. There's also secondary uses as well, but there's not enough space to highlight that on the slide. So key things that we had to look at were passive services below 24 gigahertz and how you avoid causing interference to them, because there's very sensitive satellites, so you need very strict limits on out-of-band emissions. You also have the satellite services, that's the inter-satellite service and the fixed satellite service. So you need to look at what is the potential aggregate emissions that into their receivers in space. And then we've got some downlink bands as well. The Earth Exploration Satellite Service and Space Research Service, they use that for the data downlinks from their observation satellites back to the Earth stations. So quite a lot of in-band users. The other thing is that there is a large proportion of large population of fixed users currently in the band across Europe as well. So we had to deal with coexistence analysis with all of those and work out what technical conditions needed to be put in place to make sure we had the coexistence and that the others could carry on using the spectrum as they needed. So could you turn to the next slide, please? So what we did on that, we created an ECC decision, originally before the WRC, but we updated it after. So it included the adjacent band limits for protection of the ESS, and we've got a transition time for the transition between interim and final limits. For the FSS uplinks, we created a recommendation on how you manage that coexistence in terms of the separation and coordination. For the ESS downlink, similar, but the coordination is different because it's in the opposite direction. And we had a report on how to manage that coexistence with fixed links. So on the next slide, we'll look at 40 gigahertz. Similar sort of story, but different users, different services. Key one for us that we're looking at right now is that border which is in red, which is the 40.5 gigahertz, where you've got the high density fixed satellite service, and there's expectation that the spectrum below that is going to be used for uncoordinated Earth stations. There's also some FSS usage in the same band as IMT, so that includes a mix of coordinated and uncoordinated. There's fixed usage mainly in the upper part, and there's some other usages, including broadcasting satellites and radio astronomy. But let's turn on to that 40.5 gigahertz, and on the next slide we'll look at what's happening there. I mean, this is a key thing for us, I think, at the moment, where we're talking about the connectivity requirements, because potentially those uncoordinated Earth stations are providing direct connections to broadband services for users who globally, who need to be able to access those and don't necessarily have the terrestrial infrastructure or don't want to use the terrestrial infrastructure. So we need to manage what happens at that boundary. The question of with the emission limits that you're expecting from the mobile base stations, what's the impact? Is there an impact into those satellite receivers? So you can see an example diagram there of the potential interference paths. So ECC, which is the main body in CPT that looks after spectrum issues, has looked for a balanced solution. So they've asked for PT1 to work on that coexistence studies. And the key things they've asked initially is, what is the scale of the problem, if any, based on the current assumptions on the mobile emission levels? What are the possible measures to address it, taking into account the need for the balanced approach and the implications of these measures? And are there any implications for Europe in terms of access to global equipment market arising from those possible measures? So we're doing the studies in ECC PT1 on, we studied dense urban and urban scenarios for GSO and non-GSO satellites. And we're also looking at GSO in the suburban scenario. We're not studying rural areas because we expect virtually no 40 gigahertz IMT deployments in those areas. And the latest on that is we've prepared an internal study for consideration by the ECC in November, and this is indicating for the majority of cases in dense urban and urban areas, there's no issues identified. There are a few cases where we think it's well below 1%, where there might be case of interference. In the suburban areas, for the cases where you have an earth station with a low antenna height located within the sector of the base station, there is some risk of degradation. So we're looking at some possible measures to address this. So the next steps following this is we have to create a CEP2 report. That's going back to the European Commission on what technical conditions are needed, and also a draft ECC decision that would also include those technical conditions. And we'll also put together a toolbox, which will be a recommendation which will deal with the in-band sharing, because we do also have to consider that. So very quick overview of all the work. There's a lot of work still going on in CPT on mmWave, but as you see, it's quite a challenge to manage the coexistence and make sure everyone's got access to the spectrum that we need. So that concludes my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And just to mention that we will take on questions from the audience in the end of the session when all the presentations are done. And with that, let me invite our next speaker, Mr. Luigi Ardito, Senior Director of Government Affairs at Qualcomm. Luigi, please, the floor is yours for the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Farid. It is a pleasure for me to be here and make this presentation about millimeter wave. So, in the presentation of what I would like to discuss today is the status in Europe of millimeter wave licensing, and also give you a little bit more information about basically the ecosystem and how we are doing in providing devices to the market. I think this is a very important part of the millimeter wave story. If you can go to the next slide, please. So first of all, let's say that 5G millimeter wave, I mean, for us at Qualcomm is really important, and it is required in order to have a full 5G and to really, unlock the full potential of 5G together with, the low bands and the mid bands. So it is the combination of mid, low, and high which, really unleash the full potential. When we focus on millimeter wave, actually, we have a couple of important areas for deployments. So one is, of course, the outdoor, but we can also look at the indoor deployments, complementing the capabilities which is already there, by Wi-Fi. In any case, indoor and outdoor, actually, we can see a lot of value which is provided along the value chain, to operators, the service providers, venue owners, infra vendor, device OEM, etc. Next slide, please. So when we look at, next slide, please. Okay, so when we really look at the potential use cases and places where millimeter wave is going to be adding a lot of value, we look and we think about offices, so indoor enterprises, but we look also, at transportation hubs, FWA, industrial IoT. So there are all indoor and outdoor venues. They're all cases where we really see millimeter wave, being there and adding value to the 5G business. Next slide, please. And what we have done at Qualcomm, actually together with Ericsson, we have commissioned a study to Analysis Mason, because what we wanted to do is really we wanted to see for a number of selected use cases for millimeter wave, what would be actually the value in terms of economic benefits for Europe of deploying, in that band, the 5G technologies. So we have basically, use cases like airports, industrial ports, FWA, urban and suburban locations, stadiums, and smart factories. And as you can see from the picture, actually we range from having a very high cost to benefit ratio, basically for airports of 17.4, to smart factories 5.4, and the load to basic of value in terms of billion, 75 billion of benefits for deploying smart factories, and then 46.5 billion for in FWA. This is really the present value of European-wide cost and benefits up to 2040 of deploying the 26 gigahertz. That's really the millimeter wave band, which we have asked Analyst Mason to analyze. Next slide, please. And when we look at the authorization models, which are being at the moment utilized across Europe, and we hope that this could be useful for other countries around the world, it's really, three models, which we can see. The Italian model, Italians were the first to make available in Europe a millimeter wave, the German model, and then the Finnish model. So in Italy, what they have done is actually they have they just had 1 gigahertz of spectrum. They have divided into 5 blocks of 200 megahertz each, and then they have utilized what they call the club use. So every operator holding, in the club, meaning having the spectrum, could get, spectrum from, the others if they are not using it. The German model is more a model basically based on demand, and it is really open to private networks, but also, to mobile network operator. It is based on a local basis. And then we have the Finnish model, where basically they managed to get 3.25 gigahertz of spectrum to the market, so 800 megahertz each for mobile network operators, plus, in the lower part of the spectrum, they got 850 megahertz for private networks. And this is actually something that other countries, we have seen some information coming from Spain recently. They could also go for this model. Next slide, please. So when we look at where we are in Europe in terms of making available spectrum, we have a number of countries like Italy, Finland, Greece, Slovenia, Russia, is in brackets because part of the spectrum in some areas have been made available. Slovenia, Denmark, Germany, UK, basically for the lower 2 gigahertz, and Croatia, they have made spectrum available already. There is more to come. Spain, they just announced that will make available spectrum end of this year or beginning of next year. Then we expect also, other countries like Montenegro, Estonia, Sweden, and more to come in 2022, actually, mostly coming from the Eastern European countries we expect. Plus, we have big expectation also in France for end of next year, beginning of 2023. Next slide, please. And so looking at the vendors ecosystem, which is emerging, you can see that in terms of announced millimeter wave devices, there are basically 122 devices announced. They are supported in terms of millimeter wave chips from 5 vendors. There are indoor and outdoor CPs, which are more than 30% of all announced devices. And the phones are 1/3 of all announced models. In terms of commercial availability, there are 77 devices, and basically 35 of these, are phones. So this gives you an idea that really the devices, are there. The ecosystem is completely enabled. More to come because outside of Europe, there will be places where 26 gigahertz will be made available, has been made available. So that will fuel even more the possibility, to deploy millimeter wave in Europe. Next slide, please. And this is really my last slide. So in terms of future policies, I think it is really important to get, on the fast track for Europe millimeter wave. This is really now happening. By the end of this year, we expect about 50% of the countries to have made millimeter wave spectrum available, but we still need to focus for next year on making the spectrum available. RSPG has recognized also the importance of the availability of demand for local access, for vertical networks, and also they have recommended the member states, some consistent approaches for spectrum access for verticals in the millimeter wave, and by the way, not just on the millimeter wave. So in terms of authorization, this is our last message. We believe that there are a number of authorizations models like we have seen. No one size fits all in Europe, but actually we have the right elements, the right toolbox to select. and to use the most appropriate authorization model, for, depending on national circumstances. So with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luigi. And let me once again ask everyone to send your questions. You can send them already, and we will take on them once all the participants make their presentations. Позвольте мне пригласить нашего докладчика Валерия Тихвинского. Он уже подключился, заместитель генерального директора по инновационным технологиям ООО «Национальный научно-исследовательский институт технологий и связи». Валерий, добро пожаловать назад и, пожалуйста.
Добрый день, коллеги. Видите, при всем нашем, так сказать, многообразии выбора есть всегда место для проблем с интернетом. Я хотел поблагодарить форум «Глобал», организаторов за приглашение выступить. И в сегодняшнем докладе я хотел бы вкратце осветить ситуацию с перспективами и особенностями использования миллиметрового диапазона для сетей 5G в России. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Мы знаем, что идет бурное развитие сетей пятого поколения. В настоящее время партнерским проектом 5GVP идентифицировано 5 частотных диапазонов для использования в миллиметровом диапазоне ВОЛН, 3 в релизе 15. Дополнительный диапазон был идентифицирован в релизе 16, и релиз 17 расширил частотный диапазон применяемых полос до 43,5 ГГц. И мы знаем прекрасно, что для всего этого используется режим дуплексного разноса, TDD. И мы видим, как развивается экосистема сетей 5G сейчас в миллиметровом диапазоне. На май месяц мы фиксировали, что более 166 сетей 5G в 44 странах занимается развитием сетей пятого поколения. 123 оператора в 42 странах инвестируют в сети 5G в диапазоне частот 24 ГГц, 29,5 ГГц. Это те 3 диапазона, которые были первыми номинированы, идентифицированы партнерским проектом. В настоящее время спектр абонентских устройств уже имеет 84 абонентских устройства 5G, соответственно, 27 абонентских устройств доступны в коммерческом использовании. И Россия не отстает от других стран в развитии сетей пятого поколения. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Next slide, please. Но у России есть свои особенности в использовании спектра. Главным решением Государственной комиссии по радиочастотам является решение от 17 марта 2020 года, которое определило практически все диапазоны, в которых будут развиваться сети пятого поколения в ближайшее время, в ближайшие 3 года, во всяком случае. В части миллиметрового диапазона было принято решение о выделении полосы шириной 400 МГц в диапазоне 24-25, 24-65 ГГц, прежде всего для создания технологических сетей связи. Кроме этого, этим же решением было определено, что есть возможность выделения для исследований частотных диапазонов миллиметровых волн, но этот диапазон был ограничен полосой частотой 27,5. Главной особенностями использования, операторы, которые будут использовать полосы частот, должны обеспечить синхронизацию сетей для исключения недопустимого уровня взаимных помех. И, соответственно, одним из главных условий является использование национального оборудования российского происхождения, либо наличие этого оборудования в едином регистре радиооборудования, произведенного в Российской Федерации. Тем не менее, при таких жестких условиях в июле 2020 года мобильные телесистемы, крупнейший оператор России, получил лицензию на оказание услуг в этой полосе в 83 регионах страны. И в соответствии с этим решением Государственной комиссии в этом году в мае правительство Российской Федерации внесло изменения в таблицу распределения полос частот национальных, где было четко указано, что в диапазоне 24, 25, 25, 25 будет работать сети пятого поколения. Ну, в связи с требованием использования национального оборудования, next slide, please. Правительство Российской Федерации выделило достаточно большие бюджетные средства на реализацию производства оборудования, российского оборудования. Из федерального бюджета было выделено порядка 21,5 миллиарда рублей. И в начале июня этого года госкорпорация Ростех получила от Новикомбанка еще 21,5 миллиард рублей, который в виде синдицированного кредита. Вот. И эта сумма, которая сейчас составляет 500 миллионов евро, направлена на производство оборудования базовых станций прежде всего. Госкорпорация Ростех 20 августа этого года учредила специального вендора телекоммуникационных решений для 5G ООО «Спектр», который займется реализацией дорожной карты. Вот. Таким образом, мы ожидаем появления в ближайшем будущем российского оборудования для освоения миллиметрового диапазона и, так сказать, серийного его производства. Next slide, please. Ну и в завершении своего доклада я хотел бы отметить, что в Российской Федерации уже давно реализованы технические заделы по электронной компонентной базе для использования миллиметрового диапазона и производства базовых станций для этого диапазона в России. Вот, потому что главное, все остальные решения и все остальная реализация была сделана. У нас существует несколько экземпляров базовых станций отечественного производства, которые разработали ряд компаний. Ну, основным разработчиком электронной компонентной базы является Институт СВЧ полупроводниковой электроники. Вот. И в настоящее время реализован набор малых интегральных схем для приема передающих модулей диапазонов 24 ГГц на основе нитрита галлия. Значит, в России реализован сквозной цикл изготовления таких малых интегральных схем и мощные СВЧ-транзисторы, которые станут основой производства базовых станций. Ну и понятно, что для наших производителей одним из массовых отечественных рынков для отечественной КБ станут производство базовых станций. Большое спасибо. Если у кого-то будут вопросы, я готов ответить.
Спасибо большое, Валерий. Да, вопросы мы в конце всех презентаций будем зачитывать, те, которые мы получили от аудитории. Пока я не вижу вопросов. И еще раз приглашаю всех задавать вопросы, так как диапазон такой действительно, где многие интересы присутствуют, и хотелось бы услышать мнение участников и вопросы к нашим панелистам, потому что как раз здесь очень сбалансированно подобралась команда панелистов. With that, let me switch back to English and invite our next speaker, Amy Mechelman, Vice President, U.S. Government Affairs and Policy at Viasat. Amy, thank you for being with us at so early time in the U.S., and the floor is yours. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and good morning to everybody. Thank you for having me. Well, the millimeter wave band is incredibly important, I think, for everybody on this panel and beyond. Certainly from a satellite perspective, we have been utilizing this band for quite some time, and are pleased to see that, this is remaining the case in all places in the world. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview as to how we're using it and our thoughts on the 28 gigahertz band and beyond in millimeter wave. So if we could go to the next slide. So Viasat has been around for many decades at this point. We launched our first satellite in 2004 with what's considered sort of the old satellite technology. Cost a lot at the time, but only got us about 3 gigabits per second of capacity. Fast forward, we acquired Wild Blue. Viasat 1 we launched, and Viasat 2 a couple of years ago we launched, that has about 260 gigabits of capacity. And next year we're going to launch our first of 3 Viasat 3 satellites that are going to have over a terabit of capacity. And we will launch those sequentially, first over the US and the Americas, and then next over the Middle East, Africa region, and the CIS region, and then over APAC after that. So next slide. So you can just click through if you can. So as I was mentioning, old technology, old satellite technology was slow and expensive. We attempted to change that whole paradigm by bringing everything in-house, vertically integrating, figuring out how we could get the cost per bit down. Our goal is to, have, adoption, internet adoption across the globe. So in order to do that, you need to get costs down. So that was our goal. That's what we've done. And we have made incredible strides on our ground structure as well in order to get the capacity that we're talking about. And global coverage is on the way, as mentioned. So next slide. So why are we doing this? I mean, I think we're all trying to connect, right? We're all trying to connect those areas, not only the cities, but those large geographical areas that don't necessarily get covered by, one particular technology. Satellite, we believe, is a key piece of the 5G infrastructure. No one, fiber or cable or terrestrial wireless or even satellite can be the solution for everything. So we do think it's going to be a blend of technologies, and we have been making advancements in order to fill those gaps where need be, and offer the best service we can to compete with other technologies and drive other technologies to advance themselves. So we have been focusing, as I said, on the 28 gigahertz band. We use everything from 27.5 up through 30 gigahertz today. The Viasat 3 technologies is flexible. It can be used for, fixed, mobile, urban, suburban, rural, applications. And we can do this up to a gigabit of speed. For FSS, eSIM, you'll see that, additional technologies are coming into the band, and GSO systems are coming in. So it's being utilized incredibly efficiently and effectively. We're putting as much into the band as we can possibly put in. And I think we're doing it pretty well and sharing, in a meaningful way. So next slide. So what are we seeing around the world? I mean, I think, what we've seen, even my colleagues today, I think we've seen a lot of focus on those bands that were allocated at the WRC last year, 2 years ago. I guess the pandemic has me missing years here. We've been, very pleased to see some of the decisions that are made as was mentioned, in 26 gigahertz, 40 gigahertz, and the focus to go to those bands that are very much globally harmonized. I think what we're seeing certainly in the US is a little bit of a shift from, a primary focus on 28 gigahertz to, some of the mid-band technologies, or mid-band solutions. So we're very happy to see that, especially as we, grow in the band. It just becomes a little bit more difficult to share. So next slide. So to achieve all of what we were talking about, I sort of mentioned this before, we need to make sure that we, have rules and regulatory policies to allow, satellites to land and provide the services and compete. As I mentioned, it's going to be, this 5G solution and even 6G is going to have to be a mix of technologies. Our spectrum requirements right now, it's just keeping that band where it is for satellite and making sure that we can continue to grow in that band. As we have our Viasat 4s actually in development, which will have about 4 to 5 times the capacity of even Viasat 3. So it's pretty key to us, and I know a number of the other satellite operators. As far as a way forward with millimeter wave, I think we saw 17 plus gigahertz of spectrum that was identified for IMT. I'm looking forward to seeing all those different solutions pan out, but it's a lot of spectrum. And I'd like to certainly see that, a focus there and see how those particular bands, are used in the future, and see how we can all sort of work together and make sure that we have enough spectrum to do the things that we need to do and make sure that we complement each other as needed. So next slide. So why are we doing this? We're doing this because we want to connect you, and we're doing it in a variety of ways. We're doing it, with unlimited plans. We're trying to connect folks, for school, telemedicine, telehealth, business, school, connecting the unconnected in areas, that normally can't get, decent service in a meaningful way, in those rural areas, farms, ranches, etc. And we're also doing it in mobile platforms, right? So Wi-Fi in the sky. We bought a company called RigNet recently that's providing services on oil rigs and other places in areas of the world that it's harder to get service. So we're excited about that. And certainly, again, the K-band is doing all this, working hard and making sure we are connected in the places we need it most. So I look forward to answering any questions that you guys might have. And again, thanks for having us.
Thank you very much, Amy. And yes, I can see all the panelists are back, except Valerie. Probably Valerie is still having connectivity issues. So we have one question already from the floor. The question, I will ask it to all the panelists. The question is, will millimeter wave get beyond localized uses? It seems to offer a lot of possibilities in focused geographic areas, but does not appear to be a real alternative to mid-band spectrum, C-band, like C-band. And the question is from Mark Eschenberg from IETA. So if I may ask you to respond to the question in a reverse order that you were presenting, meaning Amy, then Luigi, and then Steve. So please.
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned, and thanks for the question. As I mentioned, I do think it's going to be a little bit harder to get to the areas that we need to get to bridge that digital divide with millimeter wave spectrum. It's just a propagation issue, simply. So while it offers, certainly great promise as far as, the depth of the connectivity, I think it's just meant for different things, right? It's meant for dense applications and, throughput in those areas. So I think as I think was mentioned by my Qualcomm colleague, it's just going to be a mix of technologies, and where those geographical areas that are going to get those technologies may be limited.
Luigi, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm sorry. So basically, Amy is right, and millimeter wave was never thought to be, like a spectrum band which would replace a C-band. I mean, we are looking really here at complementing, C-band with millimeter wave, and also, like the UHF. So the three spectrum bands are all needed. That's what we thought in Europe and globally. Obviously, I mean, There are places where, I mean, we have seen in FWA, we have made experiments with Ericsson that we can achieve over 6.5 kilometer, peak rates of over 1 gigabit per second. But obviously, we are not talking about coverage bands. So they're meant to be different.
Steve, if you could also share with us your opinion, please.
Yes, thanks. Yes, I do agree. The propagation differences are quite large between C-band and millimeter wave, so they're never going to be a substitute for each other. I think they've both got their own advantages, and C-band is really good for that balance between the coverage and capacity, whereas 26 allows you to provide that real targeted capacity where it's needed. But also, because of the fact that the propagation means that the signals don't travel so far and also don't interfere so far, you can create specific localized solutions for industries that wouldn't be so easy to do if you were trying to fit it within a national license like you have in the lower spectrum bands.
Thank you very much, and we have Валерий back. Валерий, вы нас слышите?
Да, я, Фарид, вернулся, к сожалению,
Отлично.
без камеры, потому что не хватает, я так понимаю, мощности. И если можно, я так разнервничался, переводите мне вопрос, если...
Ничего страшного, да, конечно, я так планировал задать вам вопрос на русском. У нас поступил вопрос от Марка Эшенберга из компании АЭТА, и мы его всем участникам адресовали. Вопрос такой, что сможет ли миллиметровый диапазон выйти за границы локального использования. Диапазон предоставляет много возможностей для реализации решений по подключению в отдельных географических зонах, но пока считает Марк, что он не является реальной альтернативой спектру в среднем диапазоне, например, в C-band. Как вы считаете?
Я поддерживаю мнение Марка. Он является локальным диапазоном, который решает задачи обеспечения высокой плотности доступа и достижения тех скоростей, которые заложены в 5G, 20 гигабит в секунду и так далее. Поэтому добиться какого-то широкого сплошного покрытия в ближайшее время, я думаю, будет очень трудно.
Спасибо большое, Валерий. У нас еще такой есть вопрос по тому, какие страны РСС уже выделили спектр в миллиметровом диапазоне для использования 5G. И если да, или если планируют выделить, то какой график, ожидаемый таймлайн выделения этих полос? Наверное, Валерий, к вам тоже этот вопрос в первую очередь.
К сожалению, я не владею до конца полной информацией о графике выделения полос в миллиметровом диапазоне, но исходя из опыта общения в РСС, мы видим, что диапазоны миллиметровых волн будут осваиваться достаточно быстро. Почему? Потому что они наименее проблематичны с точки зрения их высвобождения от гражданских средств и высвобождения от правительственного назначения.
Может, Валерий, вы какие-то примеры знаете, на что нам стоит обратить внимание в ближайший год, где мы можем увидеть такие кейсы?
Значит, я думаю, что в ближайший год вы сможете увидеть в передовиках стран, которые развивают пятое поколение. Но сейчас усилия в основном стран СНГ направлены на освоение диапазона 3 и 4. И те кейсы, которые сейчас предлагаются, это, как правило, с ресурсодобывающими отраслями связано. Это тот же Казахстан, тот же Азербайджан, тот же Узбекистан. Там мы сможем увидеть решение по использованию миллиметрового диапазона.
Да, спасибо большое. Я пока больше не вижу в чате новых вопросов от аудитории. So let me ask a question from myself, from the ITU perspective, especially from the ITU development sector. We have an objective mission to connect all the population to the internet, and obviously millimeter wave band looks quite promising in terms of bringing connectivity to rural and remote areas. And my question is to all the panelists, how the millimeter wave band can help us to achieve this global universal connectivity. And once again, I'll ask you to answer from Amy to Luigi, Steve, and Valery, please.
So thank you for the question. I alluded to this a little bit in my presentation, but we are trying to get the most bandwidth that we can possibly get to the customer at the least expensive price possible. Again, it's all about adoption, right? I think that, our systems, once we get, all of the satellites up globally, and we're, by the way, we do partner with many other satellite companies around the world to purchase capacity as well, to make sure that we are filling those gaps to get to those customers today. But once we have our global network up, I really do think we're going to be a very meaningful provider of those services to those rural and remote areas or unconnected areas. There are some areas that are just not connected for other reasons, right? It doesn't have to be rural and remote. So we do believe that we're a solution that is competitive and will, be adopted in many aspects, both, on the ground, in the air, at the sea. So, that's how we're doing it, and looking forward to working with everybody on these solutions, because I think it's a very meaningful and critical, situation that we're in right now. Actually, given the pandemic, it's something that we need to solve.
Thank you very much. Luigi, could you please also comment on this?
Yeah, basically, of course, the millimeter wave bands are gonna, have a role to play, but as we were saying before, they are not really coverage band. If we look at, as I was saying before, use cases like FWA, 5, 6 kilometers, 7 kilometers, 1 gigabit per second, they're gonna play a role, but they're not gonna be like the key bands, for coverage. But they're gonna play a role for sure.
Thank you. Steve, please.
Thank you. Yes, I think you across the world you face a range of different requirements for connectivity. So in rural areas, it's getting that connectivity where there is none. I think satellites can have a really good role there to enable that really quickly and really cost effectively. In the city centres, connectivity issues are different. They're running out of capacity, and probably the solution there is the millimeter wave IMT that brings that, because it's no good having a signal if there's no capacity on that signal. So this is where they're crying out for capacity in some of the city. But I think it's a mix of both, and yes, satellite is doing some really exciting things at the moment in enabling that the connectivity to places that have poor or no connectivity right now.
Thank you very much. Валерий, вот вопрос у меня такой с перспективы МСЭ, как организации миссии, которая является подключить весь мир. Вот какую роль миллиметровый диапазон будет играть в том, что помочь добиться универсальной подключенности там, в тех регионах, в тех странах, где еще нет соединения с интернетом? Как вы считаете?
Ну, я считаю, что миллиметровый диапазон не совсем подходит для этого. Он, естественно, станет большой частью соединений для реализации концепции Internet of Everything. Поэтому сбрасывать со счетов миллиметровый диапазон как вспомогательный диапазон для соединения высокопроизводительных систем, и прежде всего систем, которые связаны с производством. Многие развивающиеся страны, как правило, это сырьевая экономика, это добыча полезных ископаемых, а управление современными комплексами высокоэффективными невозможно. Поэтому в будущем эти страны волей-неволей будут использовать диапазон миллиметровых волн для, так сказать, работы систем промышленной добычи. Ну, это вот мое такое мнение.
Спасибо большое. У нас вопрос от Сергея Пастуха. Почему операторы не спешат получать лицензии в миллиметровом диапазоне частот, а некоторые даже отказываются от полученных лицензий? Я, наверное, тоже попрошу всех панелистов ответить, вот начиная с Валерия уже в прямом порядке. Валерий, пожалуйста, ваше мнение.
Ну, да, пожалуйста. Я об этом сказал, что условия использования миллиметрового диапазона в России определены решением ГКРЧ. И одним из условий является использование радиоэлектронных средств российского происхождения при их наличии в едином регистре. К сожалению, Российская Федерация начало производства оборудования только в прошлом году, и массового производства радиооборудования базовых станций нет на российском рынке. Вот, так сказать, решение ГКРЧ не позволяет операторам использовать оборудование иностранного производства. Это, естественно, тормозит развитие. Ну, я думаю, что это основная причина.
Спасибо большое, Valery. Thank you very much, Valery. And the question, I'll just repeat the question in English. So why are the operators in no rush to obtain licenses in the millimeter wave band, and some even give up on the licensing that they have? And ask Steve, Luigi, and Amy in direct order to comment on this. So Steve, what's your view on this?
I think the pressure at the moment for operators is rolling out in the new C-band licenses that they've got. That's you know, they want to get that rollout for 5G and that spectrum as quickly as possible, relieve the capacity constraints that they've got in the areas. I think then the focus may move to the millimeter waves. So it's not a case that they don't want them ever. I think it's just at this moment right now, they've only just acquired the licenses in some cases in the past year or so. So it's quite understandable why their focus right now is making the most of that thing that they've just paid out money for.
Thank you, Luigi, please.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I mean, it's like, I mean, the way you want to look at it, because in Europe, of course, the operators have paid a lot of money on the mid bands. And so, like Steve is saying, they are now under pressure to deploy in those bands. But that said, you know, take markets, for example, like Italy. I mean, there are a number of operators which are deploying, and they are seeing already huge benefits, you know, from deploying millimeter wave. Now, I cannot disclose the name of operators, but you know, in Europe, but there are a number of operators that are working at the moment on actually deploying the technology in the next, you know, few months, and they will come out, you know, very soon. So it means that we are moving already, you know, from a phase where they are deploying the C-band, where they're starting the R&D activities, and they're moving, you know, like, you know, to the commercialization of millimeter wave. Now, this is, we also need to make a distinction, I mean, from region to region, because if you look, for example, at Japan, in Japan, there are all the operators actually have deployed the millimeter wave together with the C-band, because Japanese operators believe that, you know, as I was saying during my presentation, to exploit the full capabilities of 5G, you really need to deploy all the bands together. And actually, the government has provided them a number of targets, and they are, I mean, these are public data. They are like 12 to 18 months in advance of the targets, you know, in terms of deployment of millimeter wave, which were given by the government. And if you look also at the other part, you know, of the Atlantic, so the US, over there it's a different dynamic again. You know, you have the millimeter wave which were deployed to begin with, and then, you know, the mid-band were available, and now, you know, the operators are working on adding the C-band to the millimeter wave. So in a nutshell, at the end of the day, my message is all the bands are needed, the dynamics can change. We are all gonna get in the next 18 months, you know, to deploy all bands, including the millimeter wave. The dynamic is, you know, regional dependent. And at the end of the day, I think, I mean, they will all add value.
Thank you very much. And Amy, please.
Yeah, so sure. I honestly agree with virtually everything that my colleague said here. I would just add that in some regions like the US, the amount that was spent at auction in the mid-band was quite large. So the idea of getting that out and getting a return on the investment is critical, right, for the companies themselves. And I would only add that the operators that are actually heavily invested in the millimeter wave band is the satellite operators. The satellite operators around the world are doing this and have been doing it for a while. But you know, I look forward to seeing how this all plays out. I again agree with my colleagues. I think it's going to be a mix of technologies, and it's going to be a variety of or mix of bands and technologies that will proliferate over the next several years. And it's just a matter of when, not if.
Thank you very much, Amy, for the excellent comments, all the panelists, and we'll be wrapping up now. Спасибо большое, уважаемые участники, за прекрасные презентации, комментарии, интересная дискуссия, и мы как раз укладываемся в отведенное нам время, и позвольте мне передать слово Дэну для дальнейшей координации. Дэн, so I'm passing the floor to you.
Aaron, thank you very much, and yeah, echo your word of thanks to the panelists there. So fascinating discussion. Thank you all very much for that really interesting discussion, and yeah, do appreciate all of your contributions. And I think this is definitely a topic that's going to be continuing as many of the sessions that we've had at the event today and the last couple of days. So thank you all very much. Farid, thank you for expertly moderating that, and a particular thank you, I should say, to Amy for getting up so early, although I can see it's got light outside there now, so at least it's getting to daylight hours there. But thank you all very much indeed for that. So that's our final panel for the event, but don't go away yet, because we're delighted to next up be having our conclusion session. So we're going to be having some conclusions from some of our industry participants, and then we're going to be moving and looking at putting together a report. So for those of you who've participated in the event before, you'll remember that we do this most years. Albert leads a session that we want to hear from all of you on to try and get some final conclusions and to get some consensus on some of the key outcomes for the conference. So that's going to be coming up here on the main stage in just about 30 seconds or so. So please don't go anywhere, stay where you are. And in the meantime, thank you so much again to Farid and to all of our participants in that session. And as I said, I'll be back in 30 seconds or so where we can start our final conclusion session. Thank you very much.